The November wind carved through the glass canyons of Chicago's financial district like a blade forged in the depths of Lake Michigan, carrying with it the metallic scent of impending snow and the exhaust fumes of 10 million ambitions grinding against each other in the urban machinery. 42 floors above the frozen streets, where the morning light struggled to penetrate the perpetual haze of commerce and greed, the executive offices of Valmont Enterprises gleamed with the cold perfection of new money trying desperately to masquerade as old. Richard Valmont III stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of his corner office, his manicured fingers wrapped around a bone china cup filled with Jamaican Blue Mountain coffee that cost more per pound than most people in Chicago earned in a week. The liquid was bitter on his tongue, not because of its quality, but because even the finest things in life tasted hollow when you knew, deep in the marrow of your bones, that you had never truly earned them. But Richard had learned long ago to swallow such thoughts along with his morning caffeine, burying them beneath layers of Armani suits and Swiss watches and the kind of practiced arrogance that money could buy, even if respect could not. The marble floors of his office were imported from the same quarries that had built the palaces of Renaissance Italy, their veined surfaces reflecting the harsh LED lighting that he kept blazing even in the depths of winter. Every surface gleamed with aggressive cleanliness, the leather of his Hermes furniture, the chrome of his Bang & Olufsen sound system, the crystal of the whiskey decanters that he never touched before noon but always kept filled, like props in a play about success that he performed every day for an audience that included, most importantly, himself. The scent of his Tom Ford cologne hung heavy in the artificially cooled air, a cloying sweetness that failed to mask something else, something that smelled like desperation, like the fear that lived in the spaces between his confident words and his sleepless nights. Richard breathed it in and told himself it was the smell of victory, of a life lived without compromise or sentiment or the weakness that he had spent 38 years learning to despise in others. 42 floors below, in the bowels of the Willis Tower where the heating systems hummed their mechanical lullabies and the fluorescent lights flickered with the rhythm of a dying heart, Marina Santos moved through shadows that most people never saw. Her hands, cracked and reddened from industrial cleaning solutions that could strip paint from metal, guided a mop across linoleum floors with the same precision that had once navigated spreadsheets and merger documents in the gleaming offices above. The basement smelled of bleach and mold, of the accumulated moisture that seeped up from the Chicago River and the dreams that had died in these forgotten spaces. But Marina had learned to breathe through her mouth during the worst of it, to let her mind drift to other places while her body performed the repetitive motions that kept her daughter fed and housed and safe in a world that seemed designed to crush people like them beneath the weight of circumstance. She wore the same gray uniform that the building provided to all its maintenance staff, a shapeless garment that hid the elegant lines of her figure and the graceful way she moved, as if her muscles still remembered dancing at charity galas and walking across stages to receive academic honors. Her dark hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail, held in place by an elastic band that had seen better years, but even exhausted and bent over a bucket of dirty water, there was something in her posture that spoke of dignity unbroken, of a spirit that poverty could bend but never fully break. The Northwestern University MBA that hung in a cardboard box in her studio apartment in Pilsen was yellowed now with age and neglect, hidden beneath layers of bills and rejection letters and the kind of paperwork that accumulated when you lived paycheck to paycheck in a city that had forgotten how to make room for dreams that didn't come with trust funds attached. But the knowledge it represented still lived in her mind, still whispered to her in the dark hours before dawn when she calculated budgets with the precision of a Fortune 500 CFO and planned her daughter's future with the strategic thinking that had once earned her summa cum laude honors. Marina's daughter, Isabella, had been born with cerebral palsy, a beautiful, brilliant child whose mind sparkled with the same fierce intelligence as her mother's, trapped in a body that required constant care, expensive therapies, and medications that cost more per month than Marina earned in 3. The girl's laughter was the only sound that could cut through the monotony of Marina's existence, the only reminder that some things in this world were still worth fighting for, still worth the ache in her back and the chemicals under her fingernails and the way her stomach cramped from eating ramen noodles for dinner 6 nights a week. At night, when the financial district emptied of its suited warriors and their battles for market share, Marina would sometimes find herself alone in the elevator as it climbed toward the executive floors. She would watch the numbers light up. 30, 35, 40. And remember what it felt like to belong in those rarefied heights, to walk through doors that opened at her approach rather than closing at her presence. The taste of those memories was bitter as burnt coffee, sweet as champagne she would never afford again, and always tinged with the question that haunted her dreams: how had she fallen so far, and who was responsible for the lies that had stolen her life? The morning sun struggled through the November haze, casting long shadows across both the marble wasteland of Richard's office and the concrete dungeon where Marina worked. In 12 hours, they would occupy the same space for the first time in weeks, he in his throne of leather and chrome, she on her hands and knees scrubbing the stains of his excess from imported stone. Neither knew that this day would be different, that the careful architecture of lies and assumed identities would finally begin to crumble, that truth had a way of surfacing no matter how deep you buried it. But the city knew. Chicago had always been a place where the powerful rose and fell with the changing winds, where fortunes built on foundations of sand could disappear as quickly as they had appeared. The wind that howled through the streets carried whispers of change, of secrets that had festered too long in darkness, of justice that moved slowly but arrived eventually, wearing the face of an unlikely avenger with cleaning solution on her hands and fire in her heart. In the space between the marble and the concrete, between the executive suite and the basement, between the life that Richard had stolen and the life that Marina had lost, destiny held its breath and prepared to reveal its hand. The morning stretched ahead like a stage waiting for its players, and somewhere in the vast machinery of the Willis Tower, the elevator began its slow ascent, carrying with it the weight of truth and the promise of reckoning. The coffee in Richard's cup grew cold as he stared out at the city he thought he owned, never knowing that 42 floors below, the real owner of everything he held dear was wringing out a mop and planning, with the patience of someone who had learned that justice was not a sprint but a marathon, the first moves in a game that would cost him everything he had never truly earned. The memory always came to Marina in the quiet moments, when her hands moved automatically through familiar motions and her mind was free to drift backward through the corridors of time. Tonight, as she mopped the executive washroom on the 38th floor, the scent of expensive hand soap and marble cleaner dissolved into something else entirely, the warm smell of her adoptive mother's kitchen on Sunday mornings, when Eleanor Valmont would stand at the stove in her silk robe, making French toast for a little girl who didn't yet understand that love could be measured in golden slices of bread and pure maple syrup. Eleanor Valmont had been magnificent. Even now, 15 years after the car accident that had supposedly claimed her life, Marina could close her eyes and see her adoptive mother's graceful hands as they moved through their morning ritual. Those hands had built Valmont Enterprises from a small Chicago import business into a multinational corporation, had signed deals worth hundreds of millions of dollars, had held Marina close during thunderstorms and taught her that strength and gentleness were not opposites but dance partners in the ballet of a life well lived. "Business is just organized caring, darling," Eleanor had said one morning, her voice carrying that faint trace of her Swiss boarding school education that never quite left her, no matter how many decades she spent in the American Midwest. She had been standing at the kitchen island in their Lake Forest mansion, her silver hair caught in the morning light streaming through windows that overlooked 3 acres of perfectly manicured gardens. You find what people need, and you find a way to give it to them honestly. Everything else is just noise. Marina had been 22 then, fresh from Northwestern University with her MBA and drunk on the possibilities that seemed to stretch before her like an endless highway. She had worn designer suits to board meetings and carried a briefcase that cost more than most people's rent, had sat at conference tables where decisions were made that affected thousands of lives and millions of dollars. Eleanor had been grooming her, slowly and carefully, to take over the company that had been their family's legacy for 3 generations. The night before the accident, Eleanor had given Marina a small, leather-bound journal, the kind with a brass lock and a tiny key that hung from a silk ribbon. Inside, written in Eleanor's precise handwriting, were the stories of how Valmont Enterprises had really been built. Not the sanitized version that appeared in business magazines and annual reports, but the truth, The late nights when Eleanor had worked double shifts as a translator while building her import contacts, the loans she had personally guaranteed when banks wouldn't take a chance on a woman entrepreneur, the quiet acts of charity that had never appeared in any tax filings but had changed hundreds of lives. "This is your inheritance, my dear," Eleanor had whispered, pressing the journal into Marina's hands. "Not the money or the buildings or the stock certificates. This. The knowledge of who we really are, and who we choose to become." Marina had carried that journal with her through everything that followed: the phone call that came at 3 in the morning, the hurried trip to Northwestern Memorial Hospital, the unbearable silence of machines that no longer beeped because there was no longer a heartbeat to monitor. She had clutched it during the funeral, when hundreds of Chicago's elite had filed past Eleanor's casket with their practiced expressions of sympathy and their eyes already calculating how her death might benefit their own ambitions. Richard had appeared at the funeral like a gift from heaven, or so she had thought then. Eleanor's distant cousin from the East Coast, a young man with kind eyes and a gentle voice who had held Marina while she sobbed and promised that she would never be alone, that he would take care of everything. He had been so convincing in his grief, so articulate about Eleanor's legacy, so knowledgeable about the business that Marina had never questioned his claim to be Eleanor's chosen successor while she recovered from her loss. "Eleanor always said family comes first," Richard had told her, his hand warm on her shoulder as they stood in Eleanor's office just days after the funeral. "She wanted me to step in temporarily, just until you're ready to take your rightful place. We're family now, Marina. We take care of each other." But temporary had stretched into months, and months into years, and somehow Marina had found herself pushed further and further from the center of power. Her access to company accounts had been temporarily suspended pending a review of Eleanor's estate. Her office had been temporarily relocated to make room for Richard's expanding operations. Her input had been temporarily deferred while Richard handled the complex transition of leadership. The lies had been so smooth, so reasonable, wrapped in the language of corporate necessity and family concern. When Marina had finally demanded answers, had threatened to involve lawyers and challenge Richard's authority, she had been told the cruelest lie of all, that Eleanor had died bankrupt, that there was no inheritance to claim, that the company was barely solvent and only Richard's management had saved it from complete collapse. "I'm sorry, Marina," the lawyer had said, a thin man with nervous hands who wouldn't quite meet her eyes. But according to these documents, Eleanor Valmont had been living beyond her means for years. The life insurance barely covered the funeral expenses. You're going to need to find other arrangements." The journal had been her only proof that the life she remembered had been real. Hidden now in her studio apartment, wrapped in plastic and tucked inside a coffee can in the back of her refrigerator, it contained Eleanor's handwritten records of assets worth over $200 million, detailed accounts of offshore holdings and investment portfolios that should have made Marina one of the wealthiest women in Chicago. But grief had made her stupid, and trust had made her vulnerable, and by the time she understood what had been stolen from her, Richard's version of reality had been carved in legal stone. She had been left with nothing but memories and a journal that no court would accept as evidence, a woman claiming to be heiress to an empire while living in a studio apartment that smelled like her neighbor's curry and the elevated train that rattled past her window every 20 minutes. The cruelest part had been watching Richard transform from the grieving cousin who had held her hand at the funeral into the cold corporate predator who now treated her like the help. It had taken her 3 years to realize that his kindness had never been real, that every gentle word and supportive gesture had been calculated moves in a game whose rules she had never understood. By then, Isabella had been born, and Marina's world had narrowed to the immediate needs of a child who required constant care and a system that seemed designed to punish single mothers for the crime of loving their children more than money. Now, as she worked in the building that should have been hers, Marina carried Eleanor's lessons like sacred texts. Organized caring. Find what people need. Give it to them honestly. The irony was sharp as broken glass. She had found what Richard needed, which was someone to absorb his cruelty and validate his illusions of power, but there was nothing honest about the arrangement. Nothing honest about the way he looked through her as if she were invisible, nothing honest about the way he forced her to clean his office while he ate his expensive lunches, dropping crumbs deliberately for her to sweep up like some medieval serf crawling for scraps. But Eleanor had also taught her patience, had shown her that some victories took time to mature, like wine aging in careful darkness until the moment was right for uncorking. Marina had been aging her own vintage for 15 years now, collecting evidence and documenting lies and building a case that would eventually crumble Richard's world as thoroughly as he had destroyed hers. Tonight, as she moved through the empty offices where her mother's dreams had been built and her own stolen, Marina whispered the words that Eleanor had taught her: business is just organized caring. Soon, very soon, Richard Valmont III would learn exactly how much care she had been organizing, and how carefully she had planned to give him exactly what he deserved. The journal waited in her refrigerator, patient as justice, holding the truth that would set everything right. The morning of November 15th arrived with the kind of bitter cold that made Chicago winters legendary, the kind that turned breath into visible prayers and transformed the city's concrete arteries into rivers of ice and ambition. Marina Santos had been awake since 4:30, moving through the pre-dawn darkness of her Pilsen apartment with the quiet efficiency of someone who had learned to steal moments of peace from the chaos of survival. Isabella lay sleeping in the hospital bed that dominated their small living room, her breathing steady and peaceful, her face relaxed in a way that only came during deep sleep when the constant tension of managing her condition could finally ease. Marina paused beside her daughter's bed, as she did every morning, to watch the rise and fall of that precious chest, to count the breaths that meant everything was still okay, still manageable, still worth fighting for. The medication schedule taped to their refrigerator showed 3 doses due before noon, each one costing more than Marina made in a day, each one as necessary as air or water or hope. She had already laid out the pills in their color-coded containers, had prepared Isabella's breakfast and set it within easy reach, had adjusted the thermostat to exactly 74 degrees because anything colder made her daughter's muscles tighten with painful spasms. "I'll be home by 3, Marina whispered, pressing a soft kiss to Isabella's forehead. "Mrs. Rodriguez will check on you at lunch, and remember to text me if you need anything at all." The journey from Pilsen to the Willis Tower took 47 minutes on the Blue Line, 47 minutes during which Marina transformed herself from devoted mother to invisible employee, letting her shoulders curve inward, her eyes focus downward, her presence shrink until she became the kind of person that men like Richard Valmont could look through without really seeing. It was a survival skill she had perfected over the years, this ability to make herself small enough to avoid notice, quiet enough to hear the secrets that powerful people thought were safe to speak around the help. The employee entrance to the Willis Tower was a world away from the gleaming lobby where corporate executives swept through marble corridors toward elevators that moved like silk. Marina's entrance was through a loading dock that smelled of diesel exhaust and industrial cleaning supplies, where security guards barely glanced at the ID cards that marked workers as part of the invisible army that kept Chicago's financial district functioning while its real inhabitants slept. Her supervisor, a tired woman named Carmen who had been cleaning office buildings for 23 years, handed Marina her assignment sheet with the weary expression of someone who had long ago stopped expecting life to offer pleasant surprises. "Executive floors today," Carmen said, not quite meeting Marina's eyes. "Valmont's office needs special attention. Apparently, he's got some big German clients coming in for a presentation." Marina nodded, accepting the assignment with the same neutral expression she wore for everything, but inside her chest, something quickened. Richard's office. Where Eleanor's portrait still hung on the wall, where the mahogany desk that had been her mother's still sat in the place of honor, where every surface told the story of a legacy that had been stolen piece by piece until nothing remained but ghosts and the woman who remembered them. The elevator ride to the 42nd floor was a meditation in controlled breathing. Marina stood in the corner, invisible among the suits and briefcases and expensive perfumes that filled the small space with the scent of ambition and anxiety. She watched the numbers climb, 35, 38, 40, each floor taking her closer to the moment when she would once again enter the space that should have been hers, would once again kneel on floors that her mother had walked as queen. Richard's office door was already open when she arrived, the morning light streaming through floor-to-ceiling windows to illuminate a scene of calculated opulence that made Marina's chest tight with grief and rage. Everything was exactly as Eleanor had left it, and yet completely transformed by Richard's presence. The same furniture, the same art, the same view of Lake Michigan stretching toward the horizon, but somehow poisoned by the knowledge of how it had been acquired. He sat behind Eleanor's desk like a usurper on a stolen throne, his attention focused on a laptop screen that reflected the cold LED lighting in harsh geometric patterns. Richard Valmont III at 38 was still handsome in the way that money could maintain, personal trainers and dermatologists and tailors who understood how to disguise the softness that came from a life without real struggle. His suit was charcoal gray Armani, his tie pure silk in a pattern that probably cost more than Marina's monthly rent, his watch a Patek Philippe that ticked away seconds as if time itself was just another luxury he could afford to waste. "You're late," he said without looking up from his screen, his voice carrying that particular tone of bored disappointment that Marina had learned to recognize as his favorite weapon. "The Germans will be here at 11, and I need this place to look like a temple, not a tomb." Marina said nothing, because speaking was not part of her role in this carefully choreographed dance of humiliation. Instead, she moved toward the supply closet where the cleaning materials waited, her footsteps silent on the Persian rug that had once graced Eleanor's Lake Forest home. Every object in this room held memories, the crystal paperweight that Eleanor had bought in Prague, the leather-bound first editions that she had collected during business trips to London, the small bronze sculpture of a dancer that had sat on her nightstand and caught the morning light like captured music. "The marble needs to be perfect," Richard continued, still not looking at her, still speaking as if she were a piece of equipment rather than a human being. "These Germans, they notice everything. They're the kind of people who judge character by the cleanliness of a man's floors." As Marina began to unpack her supplies, Richard finally looked up from his laptop, and for just a moment, his eyes met hers directly. What she saw there made her breath catch in her throat, not the casual indifference she had expected, but something darker, hungrier. A satisfaction that went beyond mere power into something that felt almost personal. "You know," he said, leaning back in his chair with the lazy confidence of a cat who had cornered a mouse, "I've been thinking about your situation, Marina. About your circumstances." He gestured vaguely toward her uniform, her supplies, the careful way she kept her eyes downcast. "It's really quite tragic, isn't it? A woman your age, with a disabled child, working 3 jobs just to keep your head above water." Marina's hand stilled on the handle of her mop bucket, but she didn't speak, didn't look up, didn't give him the satisfaction of a response. "I mean, what kind of life is that, really?" Richard continued, his voice taking on a tone of false sympathy that made Marina's skin crawl. "No future to speak of, no prospects, no hope of ever climbing out of the hole you've dug for yourself. It must be exhausting. All that effort, all that struggle, for what? To scrub my floors and empty my trash and pretend that dignity can survive poverty." He stood then, moving around the desk with the predatory grace of someone who had never learned that cruelty was a choice rather than a birthright. "Do you know what I think, Marina? I think you're exactly where you belong. Some people are born to lead, to build empires, to shape the world according to their vision. And some people—" He paused directly in front of her, close enough that she could smell his expensive cologne mixed with something else, something that reminded her of decay. "Some people are born to serve. To clean up the messes that their betters leave behind." The silence that followed was heavy as stone, thick as the November air that pressed against the window's 42 floors above the city. Marina remained perfectly still, her hands gripping the mop handle with enough force to turn her knuckles white, her breathing carefully controlled despite the way her heart hammered against her ribs like a caged bird desperate for flight. But inside her mind, where Richard could not reach, where his words could not wound, Marina Santos was counting. Counting the lies he had told, the documents he had forged, the years of evidence she had collected like a patient spider weaving a web of justice. Counting the days until the German merger meeting, when representatives from Steinberg and Associates would arrive with their due diligence requirements and their forensic accountants and their very inconvenient questions about the true ownership of Valmont Enterprises. "Clean the marble first," Richard said, returning to his desk as if the moment of cruelty had been nothing more than a brief diversion. "And be thorough. I want to see my reflection in every inch of it." Marina nodded once, a single movement of acknowledgement that revealed nothing of the fire that burned behind her carefully controlled expression. As she filled her bucket with water and industrial cleanser, as she knelt on the floor that should have been hers and began to scrub away the stains of Richard's excess, she thought about Eleanor's journal hidden in her refrigerator, about the safety deposit box that Richard didn't know existed, about the phone call she had made to Dr. Helena Carvalho Mitchell just 3 days ago. The collision was coming. Not today, perhaps not tomorrow, but soon. And when it arrived, Richard Valmont III would finally learn the difference between earning respect and demanding it, between building an empire and stealing one, between the temporary satisfaction of cruelty and the permanent weight of justice. For now, though, Marina scrubbed. And planned. And waited for the perfect moment to reveal exactly who was kneeling on his floor. The conference room on the 43rd floor of the Willis Tower had been transformed into a cathedral of corporate power, its mahogany table polished to mirror brightness, its leather chairs arranged with military precision around presentations that would determine the fate of hundreds of millions of dollars. The November sky pressed gray and heavy against the floor-to-ceiling windows, casting the room in a light that seemed drained of warmth, as if the weather itself understood that what was about to unfold would change everything. Richard Valmont III stood at the head of the table like a general surveying his battlefield, his Armani suit pressed to knife-edge perfection, his confidence radiating from every carefully controlled gesture. The merger with Steinberg and Associates represented the culmination of 15 years of building his empire, or what he believed to be his empire. The German conglomerate's acquisition offer of $420 million would cement his position among Chicago's financial elite, would finally silence the whispered doubts about his legitimacy that had haunted the corridors of power since Eleanor's death. "Gentlemen," Richard began, his voice carrying across the room with practiced authority, "what we're discussing today is not merely a business transaction. This is the joining of two great legacies, the Valmont tradition of excellence, and Steinberg's reputation for innovation. Together, we will create something that transcends the sum of its parts." The Germans sat like carved stone statues around the table, their expressions neutral as alpine granite, their eyes missing nothing. Klaus Steinberg himself led the delegation, a man in his early 60s whose quiet intensity suggested depths that Richard had not yet learned to fear. Beside him sat Dr. Ingrid Müller, their lead forensic accountant, a woman whose reputation for uncovering corporate irregularities was legendary throughout Europe's financial districts. Marina moved through the room like a ghost, refilling water glasses and emptying ashtrays with the invisible efficiency that 15 years of servitude had perfected. To the men in their expensive suits, she was part of the furniture, no more worthy of notice than the climate control system that maintained the room's perfect temperature. But Marina saw everything, the way Klaus Steinberg's eyes lingered on Eleanor's portrait hanging behind Richard's chair, the small frown that creased Dr. Mueller's forehead as she reviewed the ownership documents, the nervous energy that Richard was trying to hide behind his facade of casual confidence. "The due diligence materials you requested are all here," Richard continued, gesturing toward the thick folders that had been placed at each seat. "As you'll see, Valmont Enterprises has maintained consistent profitability throughout my tenure as CEO. Our growth trajectory is exceptional." Klaus Steinberg opened his folder with deliberate slowness, his fingers, long and elegant despite his age, turning pages with the careful attention of a scholar examining ancient texts. When he reached the ownership documentation, he paused, and Marina noticed the almost imperceptible tightening around his eyes. Herr Valmont, Klaus said, his English precise but colored with the formal cadences of his native German, I wonder if you might clarify something for us. According to these documents, you assumed control of Valmont Enterprises in 2010, following the death of the previous CEO, Eleanor Valmont. Is this correct? Absolutely, Richard replied without hesitation. Eleanor was my cousin, a brilliant woman, but unfortunately, she had made some questionable financial decisions in her final years. When she passed away, the company was on the verge of bankruptcy. I stepped in to save what could be saved. Mueller looked up from her own folder, her gray eyes sharp as surgical instruments. And the transition of ownership was smooth? Completely smooth, Richard said, his smile never wavering. Eleanor had named me as her successor in her will. There were no complications, no challenges to the transfer of assets. Marina's hands trembled almost imperceptibly as she poured water into Klaus Steinberg's glass, but she maintained her expression of vacant servility even as her heart hammered against her ribs. This was the moment, not the revelation itself, but the careful laying of groundwork that would make the revelation devastating when it came. Klaus Steinberg accepted the water with a small nod of acknowledgement, one of the few people in the room who seemed to see Marina as a human being rather than a piece of equipment. Thank you, he said quietly, and Marina caught something in his tone, a gentleness that reminded her, painfully, of Eleanor. There is one small matter, Dar. Mueller said, her voice carrying the casual tone that Marina had learned to recognize as the most dangerous sound in the corporate world. Our preliminary research has uncovered some inconsistencies in the documentation. Nothing major, you understand, but our board requires absolute clarity in all ownership matters. Richard's confidence flickered for just a moment, like a candle in a sudden breeze. Inconsistencies? I'm not sure what you mean. Mueller consulted her tablet with the efficiency of a prosecutor reviewing evidence. According to public records filed with the Illinois Secretary of State, Eleanor Valmont's estate was never actually probated. There is no record of a will being submitted to the Cook County Probate Court. No record of any legal transfer of corporate ownership. The silence that followed was so complete that Marina could hear the whisper of climate-controlled air through the vents, the distant hum of traffic 43 floors below, the sound of her own pulse in her ears. Richard's face had gone pale beneath his expensive tan, but his voice remained steady when he spoke. That must be an administrative oversight. The legal work was handled by Eleanor's personal attorney. Perhaps there was some delay in the filings. Perhaps, Klaus Steinberg said mildly. But you understand, Herr Valmont, that Steinberg and Associates cannot proceed with an acquisition when there are questions about legal ownership. Our shareholders would never forgive such carelessness. Marina moved to the sideboard where fresh coffee waited in silver urns, her back to the table, her hands working automatically while her mind raced. This was happening faster than she had expected, the careful house of cards that Richard had built beginning to flutter in winds that he could not control. But she needed to be patient, needed to let the Germans do their work with Teutonic thoroughness before she played her own hand. Of course, Richard was saying, his voice taking on a note of desperate reasonableness. I completely understand your position. What would you need to resolve these concerns? Mueller's smile was thin as a blade. Documentation, Herr Valmont. Proof of legal ownership. The actual will, properly probated. Transfer documents filed with the appropriate state agencies. Bank records showing the legitimate transfer of assets. She paused, consulting her tablet again. And perhaps most importantly, we would need to account for the discrepancies in the asset valuations. Discrepancies? Richard's voice cracked slightly on the word. Yes. According to our research, Eleanor Valmont's personal wealth at the time of her death was estimated at over $200 million. Yet the corporate filings show the company as heavily leveraged, barely profitable. The numbers do not reconcile. Marina's cup rattled against its saucer as she set it down, the small sound echoing through the conference room like a gunshot. Every eye in the room turned toward her for a moment, but she kept her expression carefully neutral, apologetic, the face of a servant who had made a clumsy mistake. "I'm sorry," she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'll be more careful." But Klaus Steinberg's attention lingered on her face for a moment longer than the others, and Marina saw something in his expression, recognition, perhaps, or the beginning of understanding. He was a man who had built his fortune by noticing details that others missed, by seeing patterns where others saw only chaos. "There is one more matter," Klaus said quietly, his eyes still on Marina even as he addressed Richard. "Our research team has been quite thorough in their investigation of Valmont Enterprises' history. They discovered something interesting." Richard's hands gripped the edge of the conference table with enough force to turn his knuckles white. "What kind of interesting?" "They found a safety deposit box, registered under Eleanor Valmont's name, that was never accessed after her death. Never included in any estate inventory. The bank has been waiting for 15 years for someone with legal authority to claim its contents." The world seemed to tilt sideways, reality shifting like sand beneath Richard's feet. Marina could see the moment when he realized that his carefully constructed life was about to collapse, could see the panic beginning to creep around the edges of his composure like ice forming on a winter pond. "A safety deposit box?" Richard's voice was barely audible. "Yes, Dar," Mueller said, consulting her notes with professional detachment. "Box number 1247 at the First National Bank of Chicago. The bank manager was quite helpful when we explained our interest. Apparently, they've been trying to contact the estate executor for years." Klaus Steinberg leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled beneath his chin as he studied Richard with the cold precision of a scientist examining a specimen. "The bank manager also mentioned something else that struck us as curious. They said that Eleanor Valmont had visited the box just days before her death. She spent over an hour there, updating documents, they believed." Marina set down her coffee urn and moved toward the door, her role as invisible servant suddenly feeling like the most dangerous performance of her life. But Klaus Steinberg's voice stopped her before she could escape. "Excuse me, miss," he said, his tone polite but commanding. "Might I ask your name?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a gun that had been fired but not yet heard. Marina turned slowly, her heart hammering so hard she was certain everyone in the room could hear it, her carefully maintained mask of servility beginning to crack at the edges. "Marina, sir," she said quietly. "Marina Santos." Klaus Steinberg nodded thoughtfully, and Marina saw the exact moment when the last piece of the puzzle fell into place in his mind. "Santos," he repeated. "That was Eleanor Valmont's maiden name, wasn't it? Before her first marriage?" The silence that followed was the silence of worlds ending, of truths too large to be contained any longer, of 15 years of lies finally meeting their reckoning. Richard's face had gone gray as November clouds, his breathing shallow and rapid as a drowning man's. And in that silence, Marina Santos finally lifted her chin, finally let her shoulders straighten, finally allowed the fire that she had hidden for so long to kindle in her eyes as she looked directly at the man who had stolen her life. "Yes," she said, her voice steady as stone, clear as mountain water. "It was." The silence that followed Marina's simple acknowledgement stretched like a taut wire across the conference room, vibrating with tensions that 15 years of carefully maintained lies could no longer contain. Richard Valmont III sat frozen in his leather chair, his face cycling through expressions of disbelief, rage, and dawning terror as the implications of what had just been revealed began to penetrate the fog of his shock. Klaus Steinberg rose from his seat with the deliberate grace of a man who had navigated corporate battlefields for 4 decades, his eyes never leaving Marina's face as he studied the features that money and desperation had tried to disguise but could not completely erase. "Miss Santos," he said quietly, "or perhaps I should say, Miss Valmont." Marina's hands, steady now despite the earthquake that was reshaping the landscape of her existence, smoothed the gray fabric of her cleaning uniform as she stepped fully into the light streaming through the conference room windows. "Marina Santos Valmont," she said, her voice carrying an authority that 15 years of servitude had not been able to destroy. "Eleanor Valmont's legally adopted daughter." The words hung in the air like revelations carved in stone, each syllable reshaping the reality of everyone present. Mueller's fingers moved across her tablet with mechanical precision, already cross-referencing databases and pulling threads of evidence that had been waiting 15 years to be woven into their proper pattern. Richard's voice, when he finally found it, came out as a strangled whisper. That's impossible. Eleanor never had a daughter. She never mentioned, you're lying. This is some kind of elaborate fraud, some kind of what, Richard? Marina's voice cut through his stammering like a blade through silk. Some kind of carefully orchestrated plan to reclaim what was stolen from me. Some kind of justice finally catching up to a man who built his empire on forged documents and murdered hopes. She moved toward the conference table with steps that carried 15 years of accumulated dignity, 15 years of swallowed pride and suppressed rage now channeled into something far more dangerous than mere anger. As she walked, the invisible chains of servitude seemed to fall away from her shoulders, revealing the posture of a woman who had been born to command, who had been raised in boardrooms and educated in the finest universities, who had temporarily forgotten her own power but had never truly lost it. Klaus Steinberg gestured toward an empty chair with the courtesy due to an equal. Please, Miss Valmont. I think it's time we heard your story. Marina accepted the seat that should have been hers all along, her spine straight as a sword, her hands folded with the composed elegance that Eleanor had taught her during countless lessons in deportment and dignity. When she spoke, her voice carried the crystalline clarity of truth that had been too long suppressed. I was 8 years old when Eleanor adopted me, she began, her eyes fixed on some point beyond the conference room windows, beyond the gray November sky, in the realm of memory where love and loss lived forever intertwined. My birth parents had died in a house fire in Pilsen, the same neighborhood where I live now, though I don't think the irony was intentional. Eleanor found me through a Catholic charity she supported, a little girl who spoke 4 languages because my father had been a translator for the United Nations, a child who could read corporate financial statements before I could ride a bicycle. Mueller's stylus moved across her tablet screen as she documented every word, every detail that could be verified against public records and private documents that were finally being allowed to tell their stories. Eleanor didn't just adopt me, Marina continued, her voice gaining strength with each revelation. She made me her heir, her successor, her daughter in every sense that mattered. She enrolled me at Northwestern University when I was 16, guided me through an accelerated MBA program, taught me every aspect of Valmont Enterprises from the ground up. I wasn't just her daughter. I was her legacy. Richard's face had gone from gray to green, his breathing shallow and rapid as the careful architecture of his stolen life crumbled around him. This is insane. Even if you are who you claim to be, Eleanor left the company to me. She chose me as her successor. There are documents. Forged documents, Marina said quietly, and the gentleness in her voice was more devastating than any shout could have been. Documents that you created after her death, Richard. Documents that never existed while she was alive to sign them. Klaus Steinberg leaned forward, his businessman's instincts recognizing the scent of truth in Marina's words. You have proof of this? Marina's smile was sad and terrible and beautiful all at once. I have Eleanor's personal journal, written in her own hand, detailing every aspect of her estate planning. I have the key to safety deposit box 1247, which she gave me 3 days before her death, along with instructions to wait, to be patient, to let the lies reveal themselves before the truth stepped forward to reclaim what was rightfully mine. She reached into the pocket of her uniform and withdrew a small brass key, its metal worn smooth by 15 years of handling, 15 years of being carried like a talisman against despair. The key caught the conference room lighting and threw it back in tiny flashes of gold that seemed to illuminate the truth that had been hidden for so long. Eleanor knew, Marina said, her voice barely above a whisper but carrying to every corner of the room with perfect clarity. She knew about Richard's gambling debts, about his connections to organized crime in Atlantic City, about the forged family tree he had constructed to establish his claim to the Valmont name. She knew he would try to steal the company after her death, and she planned accordingly. Mueller looked up from her tablet, her expression sharp with professional interest. She planned for him to steal it. Marina nodded, and for the first time since entering the conference room as an equal, tears began to gather in her eyes, not tears of sorrow, but tears of profound gratitude for the woman who had loved her enough to orchestrate justice from beyond the grave. Eleanor was dying, she said simply. Pancreatic cancer, stage 4, diagnosed 6 months before the car accident. She had maybe 3 months to live, but she chose to keep fighting because she needed time to protect me, to protect the company, to ensure that when Richard made his move, he would hang himself with the very rope she provided. The revelation struck the room like lightning, illuminating connections and motivations that had been hidden in darkness for 15 years. Klaus Steinberg's eyes widened with something approaching awe at the elegant complexity of Eleanor's posthumous strategy. The car accident. He began. Was no accident, Marina finished. Eleanor drove herself off Lake Shore Drive on purpose, Richard. She chose the time and manner of her death to trigger the sequence of events that would eventually destroy you. She knew that your greed would overcome your caution, that you would be unable to resist claiming an inheritance that was never meant to be yours. Richard's composure finally shattered completely, his corporate mask falling away to reveal the desperate, frightened man beneath. You can't prove any of this. You're a cleaning lady, for God's sake. You're nothing. You're... I'm Eleanor Valmont's daughter, Marina said, rising from her chair with the regal bearing that 15 years of humiliation had not been able to destroy. I'm the rightful CEO of Valmont Enterprises. I'm the woman you've been forcing to scrub your floors while you sat in my mother's chair and signed documents with my mother's authority and pretended to be worthy of breathing the same air as the woman who built everything you've stolen. Klaus Steinberg stood as well, his movement sharp with decision and corporate urgency. Mueller, I want a full forensic audit of every document, every filing, every financial record associated with this company's ownership transfer. Contact our legal team in Chicago immediately. Already in progress, Dar. Mueller replied, her fingers flying across her tablet screen. I'm also arranging for immediate access to safety deposit box 1247, with Miss Valmont's permission. Marina nodded once, a queen granting permission to her subjects. You'll find Eleanor's original will there, along with complete documentation of the company's true financial position at the time of her death. You'll also find detailed records of every forged document that Richard created, because Eleanor documented everything. She was building a case, gathering evidence, preparing for this moment when truth would finally have its day in court. The conference room had become a courtroom, and Richard Valmont III had become a defendant watching his carefully constructed life sentence itself with every revelation. His empire of lies was crumbling not with dramatic explosions but with the quiet, inexorable certainty of justice that had been 15 years in the making. Outside the windows, the November sky was beginning to clear, patches of blue appearing between the gray clouds like promises that winter would eventually give way to spring, that darkness would eventually surrender to light, that truth would eventually triumph over even the most carefully constructed deceptions. The reckoning had begun. The hours that followed Marina's revelation passed like scenes from a fever dream, reality bending and reshaping itself as 15 years of carefully constructed lies collapsed under the weight of documented truth. The safety deposit box at First National Bank had yielded treasures beyond Klaus Steinberg's most optimistic expectations. Eleanor Valmont's original will, notarized and witnessed, naming Marina as sole heir to an empire worth over $400 million. Financial records that revealed hidden assets scattered across offshore accounts and investment portfolios that Richard had never even known existed. And most damning of all, Eleanor's personal correspondence with private investigators who had documented every aspect of Richard's fraudulent claim to the Valmont name. By 6 o'clock that evening, as Chicago's financial district began to empty of its suited warriors and their daily battles for profit and power, Richard Valmont III found himself in a position he had never imagined possible, sitting in the back seat of his own Bentley, no longer its owner, watching the city lights blur past the windows like the scattered remnants of his shattered life. Marina sat beside him in silence, still wearing her cleaning uniform though it no longer defined her, her presence filling the luxury vehicle with an authority that needed no expensive clothes or corporate titles to validate its power. She had insisted on this moment, not from cruelty, she had explained to Klaus Steinberg, but from necessity. Richard needed to understand, completely and finally, what he had stolen and what it had cost. "Where are we going?" Richard asked, his voice hoarse from hours of legal proceedings and forensic accounting reviews that had stripped away every pretense, every comfortable lie, every justification he had used to rationalize 15 years of theft. Marina's eyes remained fixed on the passing cityscape, on the neighborhoods that she had navigated as both queen and pauper, as both Eleanor Valmont's heir and Richard Valmont's victim. "To see your legacy," she said quietly. "To understand what your choices have created." The Bentley turned south from the financial district, leaving behind the gleaming towers where fortunes were made and lost with the stroke of a pen, entering neighborhoods where survival was measured not in quarterly profits but in the simple ability to keep heat and lights functioning through another Chicago winter. These were streets that Richard's Chicago had never included, blocks where working families struggled to maintain dignity in the face of economic forces that seemed designed to crush hope beneath the weight of necessity. The first stop was a three-flat building in Pilsen, its brick facade weathered by decades of harsh winters but maintained with the careful pride of people who understood that home was not a place you owned but a place you created through daily acts of love and determination. Marina gestured toward the second-floor window where warm light spilled through curtains that had seen better years but still served their purpose of making strangers feel welcome. "Mrs. Rodriguez lives there," Marina said, her voice carrying the warmth of genuine affection. "She's 73 years old, Richard. She raised 6 children in that apartment, worked double shifts at a laundry for 40 years, saved every penny she could to help her grandchildren go to college. Do you know what she does now?" Richard shook his head, his throat too tight for words. "She watches my daughter every day while I work," Marina continued. "She gives Isabella the medication that costs more than her monthly Social Security check, helps her with physical therapy exercises, reads her stories in Spanish and English because she believes every child should know where they come from. She does this for free, Richard. For free. Because she understands that community means taking care of each other, that wealth is measured not in dollars but in the lives we touch." The Bentley moved deeper into the neighborhood, past corner stores with hand-lettered signs and community centers where teenagers gathered to play basketball under lights that had been donated by local businesses too small to write off charitable contributions on elaborate tax returns. This was a world that existed parallel to Richard's universe of corporate power, invisible to him until now, populated by people whose names would never appear in financial magazines but whose daily courage kept the city functioning. The second stop was a small clinic in Little Village, its waiting room crowded with families who carried insurance cards like prayer cards, hoping that coverage would extend to the medications their children needed, the specialists their elderly parents required, the basic healthcare that more privileged neighborhoods took for granted. Esperanza works here, Marina said, pointing toward the clinic's entrance where a woman in scrubs was helping an elderly man navigate the steps with his walker. She could have opened a practice in Lincoln Park or River North, could have charged wealthy patients premium rates for cosmetic procedures and executive physicals. Instead, she chose to serve her community, to provide quality healthcare to people who can't afford to be sick. Marina's voice caught slightly as she continued. She's the one who diagnosed Isabella's cerebral palsy. She's the one who connected us with specialists at Children's Memorial, who helped me navigate the insurance bureaucracy, who sometimes doesn't charge us anything when she knows I can't afford the copay. Richard stared through the Bentley's tinted windows at the clinic where hope and desperation intersected in the lives of families who faced medical crises without the cushion of trust funds or comprehensive insurance policies. For the first time in his adult life, he was seeing the world that existed beyond his comfortable bubble of privilege, beginning to understand the weight of responsibility that came with the power he had stolen. The final stop was Marina's studio apartment, a narrow building squeezed between a taqueria and a small grocery store where Spanish and English mixed freely on handwritten signs advertising fresh produce at prices that reflected the economic reality of their customers. Marina led him up 2 flights of stairs that creaked with age but were scrubbed clean with the kind of pride that poverty could not diminish. The apartment itself was smaller than Richard's walk-in closet, but every inch had been organized with the efficiency of someone who understood that space was a luxury and waste was a sin. Isabella's hospital bed dominated the living room, surrounded by medical equipment and therapy tools that represented months of Marina's salary, purchased one piece at a time with the patient determination of a mother who refused to accept limitations for her child's future. Isabella herself was awake, propped up against pillows that Marina had arranged to support her delicate frame, her dark eyes bright with the intelligence that her physical limitations could not dim. When she saw her mother enter with a stranger, she smiled with the pure joy that can only come from someone who has learned to find happiness in small moments. "Mommy," she said, her voice clear despite the effort it required, "you're home early." Marina knelt beside her daughter's bed, smoothing the girl's dark hair with hands that shook slightly from the emotional weight of the day. "Yes, sweetheart. I have some news, good news. Very good news." Richard stood in the doorway, his expensive suit incongruous in the modest apartment, his entire worldview reshaping itself as he watched Marina transform from the invisible servant he had tormented into the devoted mother who had sacrificed everything for her child's welfare. The contrast was devastating, not just between wealth and poverty, but between the genuine love that filled this small space and the hollow emptiness of his mansion in Lake Forest with its unused rooms and meaningless luxury. "This is where your choices led us, Richard," Marina said quietly, never taking her eyes off her daughter's face. 15 years of watching you live in my mother's house, sitting behind my mother's desk, making decisions with my mother's authority while I cleaned floors to pay for Isabella's medicine. 15 years of 3 jobs and 20-hour days and choosing between rent and medication because you couldn't bear the thought that someone else might be entitled to what you had convinced yourself was yours. Isabella's eyes moved from her mother to Richard, studying his face with the unguarded curiosity of someone too young to understand that adults could be cruel by choice rather than circumstance. "Are you Mommy's friend?" she asked in her careful English, each word shaped with the deliberate precision of someone for whom speech required effort. The question hung in the air between them, innocent and devastating, carrying implications that went far beyond its simple words. Richard knelt beside Isabella's bed, his movements uncertain, his face cycling through emotions he had spent decades learning to suppress. He began, then stopped, the words he wanted to speak tangling with the weight of what he had done, what he had stolen, what he had destroyed through his choices. "I used to work with your mother, sweetheart. We worked together for a long time." Isabella smiled, the expression lighting up her face with genuine warmth. "Mommy works very hard," she said seriously. "She takes care of lots of people. She takes care of me and Mrs. Rodriguez and the people at her office, and sometimes she brings home food for Mr. Garcia downstairs when his checks don't come." Each word was a small knife turning in Richard's chest, revealing the scope of Marina's character, the way she had maintained her humanity and her generosity even while he had systematically stripped away her dignity and her hope. He was beginning to understand that he had not just stolen money or property or corporate control, he had stolen years of a life that could have been spent differently, more freely, with the resources to pursue dreams instead of merely surviving nightmares. "Isabella," Marina said gently, "Richard and I need to talk about grown-up things. Why don't you practice your Spanish with the workbook Dr. Rodriguez brought you?" As Isabella dutifully turned her attention to her studies, Marina led Richard to the small kitchen where empty medication bottles lined the windowsill like a museum of their struggles, each label telling the story of a different medical challenge overcome through sheer determination and financial sacrifice. "Do you understand now?" Marina asked, her voice soft but carrying the weight of 15 years of accumulated sorrow. "Do you see what your lies cost? Not just the money, Richard, but the life my daughter could have had. The treatments we couldn't afford, the opportunities we couldn't pursue, the simple dignity of not having to choose between medication and groceries every month." Richard's composure, what little remained of it, finally cracked completely. The tears came suddenly, without warning, carrying with them years of suppressed guilt and the terrible recognition of what he had become. "I didn't know," he whispered, though even as he spoke the words, he understood they were inadequate, that ignorance was a choice he had made daily for 15 years. "You didn't want to know," Marina corrected gently. "It was easier to see me as part of the furniture, as someone whose suffering validated your superiority. It was easier to believe that poverty was a moral failing rather than a circumstance that could happen to anyone, even someone who had been raised with every advantage." The silence that followed was heavy with the weight of revelation and the possibility of redemption. Outside the apartment windows, Pilsen was settling into evening, families gathering for dinner, children finishing homework at kitchen tables, ordinary people living extraordinary lives of quiet courage and daily grace. When Richard finally spoke again, his voice was barely audible. "What happens now?" Marina looked toward the living room where her daughter was carefully forming letters in her workbook, where 15 years of struggle were finally giving way to the promise of a different future. "Now," she said, "you learn what it means to make amends. You learn what it means to use privilege responsibly. You learn what Eleanor tried to teach both of us, that wealth is not a reward for superiority, but a responsibility to serve something larger than ourselves. The redemption would not be easy, and it would not be quick. But in that small kitchen in Pilsen, surrounded by the evidence of what genuine love could accomplish even in the face of overwhelming hardship, Richard Valmont III began the slow, painful process of becoming someone worthy of the name he had stolen and the legacy he was finally learning to understand. The news of Richard Valmont III's downfall and Marina Santos Valmont's restoration spread through Chicago's financial district like wildfire in August, crackling from trading floor to boardroom to exclusive clubs where the city's elite gathered to dissect the rise and fall of their peers. By the end of the week, the story had evolved beyond mere corporate drama into something approaching urban legend: the cleaning lady who had been a secret heiress, the executive who had built his empire on forged documents, the dead woman who had orchestrated justice from beyond the grave. The first ripples were felt within Valmont Enterprises itself, where employees who had worked in the shadow of Richard's casual cruelty suddenly found themselves breathing air that tasted different, cleaner somehow, as if a toxic cloud that they hadn't realized was poisoning them had finally lifted. Carmen Rodriguez, the tired supervisor who had distributed cleaning assignments for 23 years, stood in the employee break room on the building's third floor, staring at the memo that had changed everything. Effective immediately, she read aloud to a small group of maintenance workers who had gathered around the bulletin board like pilgrims at a shrine: all custodial and support staff salaries will be increased by 40%. Additionally, comprehensive health insurance will be provided at no cost to employees, including coverage for family members and pre-existing conditions. Carmen's voice caught as she continued, paid educational leave will be available for any employee wishing to pursue further training or higher education. Maria Gonzalez, who had been emptying trash cans in the Willis Tower for 8 years while studying accounting through online courses she paid for with overtime wages, wiped tears from her eyes with the back of her hand. 40%, she whispered. I can finally quit my weekend job. I can finally spend Sundays with my kids instead of cleaning offices in Schaumburg. The changes rippled outward from there, touching lives in ways that numbers on a balance sheet could never capture. Esperanza Martinez received a phone call on a Tuesday morning that would alter the trajectory of her small clinic in Little Village. Marina's voice, still carrying traces of disbelief at her own words, had delivered news that felt like answered prayers. The Valmont Foundation, Marina had explained, will be providing a $2 million endowment for your clinic. Enough to hire 2 additional doctors, purchase new equipment, and establish a fund for patients who can't afford their medications. There had been a pause, the sound of someone learning to wield power for healing rather than harm. My daughter. Isabella, she wanted this to be the first gift we made. She said everyone should have a doctor like you. Martinez had sat in her cramped office, surrounded by files of patients whose treatment had been delayed by insurance denials and families who rationed medications to make them last longer, and understood that miracles sometimes came disguised as accountants with forensic software and safety deposit boxes that had waited 15 years to reveal their secrets. The transformation of Richard himself proved to be the most complex ripple of all. The man who had once inhabited Eleanor's office like a conqueror claiming spoils now found himself in a studio apartment in Uptown, smaller even than Marina's place in Pilsen, learning to navigate a world where grocery store circulars mattered and public transportation schedules determined the rhythm of daily life. The Bentley was gone, sold along with the Lake Forest mansion and the Swiss watches and everything else that had once defined his identity. But the most profound changes were invisible to casual observers. Richard had begun working at a legal aid clinic on the South Side, using the Northwestern law degree that he had earned before greed had corrupted his ambitions, helping people navigate the same systems that had once served his interests exclusively. The work paid barely enough to cover rent and groceries, but it offered something that 15 years of stolen wealth had never provided, the possibility of earning respect rather than demanding it. His first client had been an elderly woman named Mrs. Patterson, whose grandson was facing eviction after losing his job at a factory that had moved operations to Mexico. Richard had spent 3 days researching tenant rights law and negotiating with a landlord who was more interested in profits than people, eventually securing a payment plan that would keep the family housed through the winter. When Mrs. Patterson had hugged him in gratitude, Richard had experienced something he had forgotten was possible, the satisfaction of using his abilities to solve problems rather than create them. You know, Mrs. Patterson had said as she gathered her paperwork with hands that shook slightly from arthritis, you remind me of my late husband. He used to say that a man's character wasn't measured by what he could take from the world, but by what he chose to give back. The words had followed Richard home to his sparse apartment, echoing through rooms that contained nothing of value except the growing possibility of redemption. He had called Marina that night, his voice uncertain as he navigated the strange territory of making amends. I've been thinking, he had said, about what Eleanor would have wanted. About what she was trying to teach us. There had been a long pause, the sound of someone choosing words carefully. I want to help, Marina. Not because I expect forgiveness, but because it's what I should have been doing all along. Marina's response had been measured, cautious, like someone who had learned not to trust easily but was willing to observe actions rather than words. There's a family in Pilsen, she had said finally. The Herrera family. Their youngest son needs surgery for a heart defect, but their insurance won't cover the full cost. If you're serious about helping, start there. Richard had spent the next week learning about medical advocacy, insurance appeals, and the labyrinthine world of hospital billing departments. He had discovered that his years of corporate experience, once used to maximize profits at the expense of human welfare, could be redirected toward navigating bureaucracies on behalf of those who lacked the resources to fight for themselves. The Herrera boys' surgery had been approved after Richard spent 18 hours on the phone with insurance companies, hospital administrators, and charity foundations, each conversation a small victory against systems designed to discourage persistence. The ripples spread beyond individual lives to reshape entire institutions. Klaus Steinberg, impressed by the elegant complexity of Eleanor's posthumous justice and Marina's dignified handling of her restoration, had restructured his proposed merger into something unprecedented, a partnership that would combine German efficiency with American innovation while maintaining Valmont Enterprises' new commitment to stakeholder capitalism rather than profit maximization. What we are creating, Klaus had explained during the renegotiated merger announcement, is a model for how corporations can serve not just shareholders, but entire communities. Frau Valmont has shown us that true wealth is measured not in quarterly returns but in lives improved, opportunities created, and hope restored. The announcement had been made from the same conference room where Richard's lies had been exposed, but the atmosphere was entirely different. Marina stood behind the podium where he had once held court, wearing a tailored suit that spoke of authority earned rather than assumed, her voice carrying the quiet confidence of someone who had learned leadership through service rather than dominance. Valmont Enterprises, she had said, will be guided by the principles that my mother taught me, that business is organized caring, that profit without purpose is just mathematics, and that our success will be measured not by what we accumulate for ourselves, but by what we make possible for others. In the audience, employees who had lived under Richard's regime of casual cruelty listened to promises that seemed too good to be true, but were backed by concrete actions that had already begun to transform their daily lives. Comprehensive healthcare, educational opportunities, profit-sharing programs that would give every worker a stake in the company's success, these were not merely corporate slogans but commitments written into the company's new charter. The transformation extended to the building itself. The 42nd floor, once a monument to individual ego, was redesigned as a collaborative workspace where decisions were made transparently and every voice was heard. Eleanor's portrait was moved to the lobby, where all employees and visitors could see the woman whose vision had created not just a company but a community of people committed to lifting each other up. Isabella's medical care, no longer constrained by insurance limitations and financial desperation, had blossomed into a comprehensive program that addressed not just her physical needs but her intellectual potential. The best pediatric specialists in Chicago now consulted on her case, not because they were paid extraordinary fees, but because Marina had quietly funded research into cerebral palsy treatment that would benefit thousands of children beyond her own daughter. The girl herself, now 13 and growing stronger each day, had become something of a phenomenon in her own right. Her essay about living with disability while maintaining hope had been published in the Chicago Tribune, leading to speaking engagements at schools throughout the city where she talked about the difference between pity and compassion, between charity and justice. My mama always told me, Isabella would say to auditoriums full of children who had never thought about privilege or access or the ways that society could include or exclude people based on circumstances beyond their control, that being different isn't being less. It's just being different. And sometimes, being different helps you see things that other people miss. The foundation that bore Eleanor's name had grown beyond anyone's expectations, funded not just by Valmont Enterprises' profits but by donations from people throughout Chicago who had been inspired by the story of justice delayed but not denied. The foundation's programs ranged from medical clinics in underserved neighborhoods to scholarship funds for first-generation college students to small business loans for entrepreneurs who had been ignored by traditional banking systems. But perhaps the most significant ripple was the one that could not be measured in dollars or quantified in quarterly reports, the restoration of faith in the possibility that systems could change, that justice could prevail, and that ordinary people possessed extraordinary power when they chose to use it for something larger than themselves. On quiet evenings in Pilsen, when the day's work was done and families gathered around dinner tables to share stories and dreams, Children who had grown up believing that poverty was permanent and struggle was inevitable now spoke of futures that seemed possible rather than impossible. The ripples of Marina's restoration had become waves of hope, washing across a city that had learned to expect disappointment and teaching it to believe, once again, in the possibility of transformation. The revolution had been quiet, conducted in boardrooms rather than streets, but its effects were no less profound for their subtlety. Chicago had remembered that wealth was not just an accumulation of resources but a responsibility to serve, that power was not just the ability to control but the opportunity to empower, and that justice, while sometimes delayed, was a force as inevitable as gravity itself. In the end, Eleanor Valmont's greatest legacy was not the fortune she had built or the company she had created, but the lesson she had taught from beyond the grave, that love, properly organized and patiently executed, was the most powerful force in the universe, capable of transforming not just individual lives but entire communities, one carefully planned ripple at a time. 3 years later, on a crisp October morning when Lake Michigan sparkled like scattered diamonds beneath the autumn sun, Marina Santos Valmont stood at the windows of the renovated executive floor of the Willis Tower, watching Chicago wake up to another day of possibilities. The view from the 42nd floor remained as breathtaking as ever, but everything else had changed. The office behind her buzzed with the collaborative energy of teams working toward shared goals rather than individual ambitions. The building below housed programs that served the community rather than merely extracting profit from it. And the city stretching toward the horizon had become a living testament to the power of patient justice and organized compassion. Isabella, now 16 and radiant with the confidence that comes from being valued for her mind rather than limited by her body, sat at a conference table designed for accessibility, her laptop open to a presentation she had prepared for the Valmont Foundation's board meeting. The young woman who had once been confined to a hospital bed in a studio apartment now served as the Foundation's youth advisory director, her insights and experiences guiding programs that had touched thousands of lives across the Chicago metropolitan area. The scholarship recipients from this year's cohort, Isabella was saying, her voice clear and strong as she addressed the board members gathered around the table, represent every neighborhood in the city. We have future doctors from Pilsen, engineers from Englewood, teachers from Austin, and social workers from Little Village. Their collective story is proof that talent exists everywhere, opportunity just needed to find them. Helena Carvalho Mitchell, now serving as the Foundation's legal counsel, nodded with the satisfaction of someone who had seen justice not just served but transformed into systematic change. The ripple effects continue to amaze me, she said, consulting her tablet where data told stories of transformation that statistics could barely capture. Property values in previously overlooked neighborhoods are rising, but not because of gentrification, because residents now have the resources and support to invest in their own communities. Marina smiled as she listened to the conversation that had become routine, dedicated people solving complex problems with creativity and persistence rather than accepting limitations as permanent fixtures of urban life. The woman who had once scrubbed floors while dreaming of justice now found herself overwhelmed by the mundane miracle of justice actually working, systematically and sustainably, one carefully designed program at a time. The Valmont Foundation had grown beyond anyone's initial vision, its endowment now exceeding $50 million, its programs serving over 10,000 families annually across the greater Chicago area. But the numbers, impressive as they were, told only part of the story. The real legacy lived in the details, in Mrs. Rodriguez, now 66 and working reduced hours as a paid consultant for the Foundation's elder care programs rather than struggling to survive on Social Security alone, in Dr. Esperanza Martinez, whose clinic had expanded to include 3 locations and was training a new generation of doctors committed to community health, in the hundreds of small businesses that had been launched with microloans and mentoring from entrepreneurs who understood that economic development meant creating opportunities for everyone, not just those who already had advantages. Richard's transformation had been perhaps the most unexpected element of the Foundation's success. The man who had once epitomized corporate greed now directed the Foundation's legal advocacy program, using his Northwestern law degree and hard-won understanding of systemic inequality to fight for policy changes that would prevent other families from experiencing the kind of exploitation that had once been his specialty. His apartment in Uptown remained sparse and humble, but his days were filled with the satisfaction that comes from using privilege responsibly rather than selfishly. The housing rights legislation passed the city council last week, Richard reported to the board, his voice carrying none of the arrogance that had once characterized his public speaking but filled instead with the quiet pride of incremental progress. Starting next year, landlords will be required to accept housing vouchers in all neighborhoods, not just the ones that poor people are traditionally allowed to access. It's a small step, but it means families can choose their communities based on opportunity rather than being segregated by income. Marina caught his eye across the conference table and offered a small nod of acknowledgement. Their relationship had evolved over 3 years from mutual wariness to cautious respect to something approaching genuine collaboration, though forgiveness remained a complex and ongoing process rather than a single moment of absolution. Richard had learned to measure his success by the problems he solved rather than the recognition he received, and Marina had learned that redemption was possible even for those who seemed irredeemably lost, though it required genuine change rather than merely good intentions. The foundation's crown jewel was the Eleanor Valmont Community Campus, a renovated warehouse complex in Pilsen that housed everything from pediatric medical clinics to job training programs to a culinary school that trained young people for careers in Chicago's thriving restaurant industry. The campus served over 500 families daily, but its real innovation was its integrated approach to addressing poverty. Rather than treating symptoms individually, it addressed root causes systematically, providing healthcare, education, legal services, and economic development under one roof. Klaus Steinberg, now a permanent partner in Valmont Enterprises rather than merely an acquirer, had brought European models of stakeholder capitalism to Chicago, demonstrating that corporations could prioritize employee welfare and community development while remaining profitable. The company's revenue had actually increased under Marina's leadership, proving that ethical business practices were not obstacles to success but foundations for sustainable growth. The quarterly numbers continue to exceed projections, Klaus reported with the satisfaction of someone who had discovered that doing good and doing well were not mutually exclusive goals. Employee productivity is up 18% since we implemented profit sharing, customer loyalty has increased by 25% since we began sourcing from minority-owned suppliers, and our reputation for corporate responsibility has attracted clients who specifically want to work with companies that share their values. But the day's most significant agenda item was not financial or programmatic, it was personal. Marina had called the board meeting to discuss the foundation's next phase of development, its evolution from a Chicago-focused organization to a national model for community development through corporate responsibility. "We've proven that this works," Marina said, turning from the windows to address the people who had become her partners in the quiet revolution that Eleanor had designed and Isabella had helped implement. "The question now is whether we're ready to share what we've learned with communities across the country that are facing the same challenges we encountered here." The proposal was ambitious. A network of Valmont Foundation affiliates in cities from Detroit to New Orleans, from Phoenix to Portland, each adapted to local conditions but united by common principles of justice, sustainability, and the radical notion that everyone deserved access to opportunity regardless of the circumstances of their birth. Isabella's eyes brightened with the enthusiasm that always emerged when she contemplated possibilities rather than limitations. "I've been corresponding with student groups at universities across the country," she said, her fingers moving across her laptop keyboard with practiced efficiency. "There are young people everywhere who want to be part of something bigger than themselves, who understand that their generation will inherit the consequences of decisions being made today." Carvalho Mitchell leaned forward, her legal mind already working through the complexities of expanding operations while maintaining quality and accountability. "The infrastructure requirements would be substantial," she said thoughtfully. "But the demand is certainly there. I've received inquiries from mayors, university presidents, and community organizations in over 40 cities." Marina felt the familiar flutter of anxiety that accompanied major decisions, the weight of responsibility that Eleanor had carried and that she was still learning to bear gracefully. But she also felt something else, the quiet confidence that comes from having seen impossible things become routine through persistence and collaboration. "My mother used to say that business was organized caring," Marina said, her voice carrying across the conference room with the authority of someone who had learned leadership through service rather than inheritance. "What we've built here is proof that she was right, that when you organize caring systematically, when you approach love like a business plan and execute compassion with corporate efficiency, you can change the world one community at a time." The vote was unanimous, though the real decision had been made months earlier through countless small choices, daily commitments to principles over profits, and the accumulated weight of evidence that justice was not just a moral imperative but a practical necessity for sustainable prosperity. As the board meeting concluded and the members dispersed to their various responsibilities, Marina remained at the windows, watching the city that had become both her laboratory and her legacy. Below, Chicago moved through its afternoon rhythms, children walking home from schools where they were learning that their dreams were valid regardless of their zip codes, workers heading home to families that no longer had to choose between healthcare and groceries, entrepreneurs opening small businesses with microloans and mentoring that had transformed ideas into opportunities. Isabella joined her at the windows, her presence warm and steady beside her mother's shoulder. "Do you think Grandma Eleanor would be proud?" she asked, the question carrying the weight of someone who had never met her grandmother but had inherited her vision and her responsibility. Marina's reflection in the glass showed a woman transformed, the exhaustion and desperation that had once defined her features replaced by the quiet satisfaction that comes from work that matters, from problems solved rather than merely endured, from a life lived in service to something larger than personal advancement. "I think," Marina said quietly, wrapping an arm around her daughter's shoulders, "that she would be amazed by what you've become. By what we've all become." She gestured toward the city sprawling beyond the windows, toward neighborhoods where her foundation's programs were writing new stories of possibility. "She planned for justice, Isabella, but what we've built is bigger than justice. We've built hope. Systematic, sustainable, replicable hope." The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the office that had once been a monument to individual ego and was now a command center for collective progress. Eleanor's portrait, visible from every angle, seemed to smile with the satisfaction of someone whose greatest gamble had paid dividends beyond her wildest imagination. Outside, Chicago prepared for evening, a city transformed not through dramatic revolution but through patient evolution, one life at a time, one family at a time, one carefully organized act of caring at a time. The legacy was not just financial or programmatic, it was philosophical, a living demonstration that love properly applied could indeed change the world, that justice delayed was not necessarily justice denied, and that sometimes the most powerful revolutions were the ones conducted in conference rooms by people who had learned that true wealth was measured not in what you accumulated for yourself, but in what you made possible for others. In the end, Eleanor Valmont's greatest gift to her daughter had not been a fortune or a company or even justice. It had been a vision of what the world could become when power was used for service rather than domination, when wealth was treated as opportunity rather than entitlement, and when love was organized with the same efficiency and persistence that previous generations had reserved for the accumulation of profit. The sun set over Lake Michigan, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson that reflected off the windows of the Willis Tower like promises of tomorrow's possibilities. And in the gathering dusk, the lights of Chicago began to twinkle like stars that had chosen to live among the people, illuminating streets where dreams were no longer luxuries but expectations, where hope was not just sentiment but strategy, where the future was being written one carefully planned, systematically executed, lovingly organized day at a time. The legacy was complete, but the work would continue forever.